This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. Now, this week we're going to talk about a particular underworld daimonic figure. And remember, I talk about daimons as being different from demons, even though they're meant to be some overlap in the term. But daimons are these kinds of forces or spirits that are associated with different locations, and who act as intermediaries. And this one is known as Empusa, or the Empusai, in the plural. And the Empusai are associated with the Lamia, or the Lamii in plural, and the Mormalikii, which are all these kinds of figures that show up as these kinds of vampiric kinds of ghosts. They're these terrifying feminine figures that appear, that are associated. In particular, the Empusa is associated with Hecate, and the mentions of Empusa in ancient Greek literature always seem to center around, they're definitely underworld connected, and they're always seen as attendants of Hecate. Now, the Empusa are rather interesting because they're also considered to be a kind of restless dead. Sarah Iles Johnston talks about them in her book, The Restless Dead, and these are sort of an angry, unavenged dead. So there's that factor to be considered, and as we've seen in other podcasts, there tends to be a relationship between these kinds of scary, daimonic, underworld figures. Not all of them, but many of them, and women who have died before their time for some reason. Okay, often before bearing children, as we've seen in the one episode that I did on the Aori. But Empusa is rather interesting by way of the way she is described, and the sources that mention her are sources that make reference to the Orphic mystery cults, the cult of Eleusis, the Demeter cult in particular, but also associated with Dionysus as well. And of course, those two, both of those cults certainly had secret initiations at the time, and are probably very much connected in a lot of ways. So what I want to talk about, the way I want to talk about Empusa, there's a lot to talk about. So my mind's already going in a million different directions. But I want to start with a basic description of her, and I want to talk about the stories and sources. There's two main ones that are associated with Empusa. And also we're going to talk about her relationship to another demonic figure out of the Testament of Solomon called Onoskelis. And after that, I'm going to want to refer a bit to Sarah Iles Johnston, what she has to say about the Empusa, which is fascinating, because then it leads us into this other territory of the role of these kinds of these scary underworld intermediaries that are female. And what they may actually represent, or what they may be, what is the takeaway from them? What is their function, and what do they tend to represent, not only as a psychological force, but perhaps just as a phenomenal reality of some kind. So let's begin at the beginning. I think the first description I would like to read is from I have the Dictionary of Classical Mythology, and here is how they define the Empusa. One of the creatures in Hecate's entourage. She belonged to the underworld and filled the night with terrors. Empusa could assume various shapes and appeared particularly to women and children. She fed on human flesh and often assumed the form of a young girl to attract her victims. Okay, so already here we see this idea, this flesh eating, which we associate with the cannibalistic hag motif that we see with the dark feminine, and also there's that vampiric, feeding on blood, as it were. And then we see this idea of her as a shapeshifter, which also is not uncommon among some of these magical Chtonic kind of underworld deities. Let me bring up another description of her. It says the Greek Empusa is a shape-shifting female being in Greek mythology, said to possess a single leg of copper, commanded by Hecate, whose precise nature is obscure. In late antiquity, the Empusai have been described as a category of phantoms or specters, equated with the Lamii and Myrmelikia, thought to seduce and feed on young men. Now, the name Empusa is interesting because she's one-legged, namely having one brass leg or a donkey's leg, okay, and thus being known by the epithets Onokelis and Onoskelis, both of which mean donkey-footed. And the name Empusa in general, the word that we have impede, or the pusa part of the name, or pusa, that refers to the foot, okay. Anything pus, like Oedipus is swollen foot. So in this case, we're talking about, this relationship to them as being donkey-footed. So there's, so the idea of foot. So when you talk about impeding progress, it's the idea that, there's something in front of your foot that doesn't allow you to step forward. So we see this idea already of Empusa as representing an impediment, an obstacle. And one of the things right off the bat that comes to my mind is that the biblical idea of Satan, certainly the original idea, has to do with one who, stands in the way. Diabolos, the term Diabolos, and also the term, Satan as it has been represented, tends to, at least the angelic role of Satan within biblical tradition, or the Satan, angel acting as Satan, is to stand in one's way, to produce an obstacle so that you cannot move forward. And what we are going to see is that in initiations, it has appeared that Empusa, maybe one of the figures, probably played by an actor, but who would have appeared in one of the initiatory rites of the cults of Eleusis or the cults of Dionysus, where you have these rites that are meant to remove fear of death and allow one safe passage in the underworld after death. One of the sources I was reading was mentioning how Heracles, before he had to go complete his labor of going down to the underworld to bring back Kerberos, the three-headed dog that guards the gate, was that he wished to have this, wished to take this particular initiation, which are often known as the greater mysteries of Eleusis. There's the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries. And the lesser mysteries, interestingly, Sarah Iles Johnston talks about this, seems to be connected to the idea of expiating blood guilt. Okay, so in Heracles' case, he had not only, he had certainly murdered his wife, but that he'd already been, gone through the cleansing process for that crime. But this had to do with the killing of the centaurs, and his, and of course his accidental wounding of Chiron. That he had to pay blood guilt because you did not want to undergo this initiation and face these kinds of deities or these kinds of daimons, I should say, that are like Empusa, without having undergone that ritual, which is very interesting. So he might have been sent back to go undergo the lesser mysteries, which would have provided that cleansing process before actually going on to the greater mysteries that would involve encountering and confronting these kinds of entities as a means of overcoming fear of death or overcoming fear of the underworld, among whatever other things that might mean. So we see this idea of a beautiful woman who may have a brass leg, who may have a donkey leg. I believe there's at least one other a description of her, but that I'm sure I'm going to come across it as I'm going through the material here. But we also might remember figures that we talked about a couple years ago, such as the Bavanshi, who were beautiful women, except that if they picked up their skirts and you saw their feet, they usually had cloven hooves, so they had some kind of an animal feet, which is later associated with what's either vampiric or demonic. Now, it's worth noting also, I'm just going to mention when it comes to donkey and the symbolism of the donkey, we tend to see donkeys in the biblical sense as representing sort of that, plodding perseverance, humility. Donkeys tend to be seen much more positively as representing, certain kinds of humble virtues when you look at the biblical tradition. The ancient Greeks didn't see the donkeys that way. They saw them as kind of clumsy and slow, and perhaps stubborn. And so in this sense, there's an element there almost, kind of like the clumsy donkey legs on the beautiful woman, as it were, give her almost a tricksterish kind of an element, which again would connect her to these ideas of, of the diablos, of Satan. Because these all have these kinds of very tricksterish elements. Now, mind you, when I say that, I'm not referring to the Empusa as a representation of ultimate evil, which is not how I see Satan. Satan is, as I said, is an oppositional figure, is one that is meant to oppose, and and can be tricky in their behavior and dealings. Again, trickster does not have to mean evil. It may be inconvenient, and it may be chaotic, and it may be upsetting or disturbing, but it doesn't necessarily have to represent something that's evil. Okay, people who've listened to this podcast long enough know I'm not into the whole idea that these things are definitely good and these things are definitely evil. That said, there's of course forces that you need to be very careful before you engage with. Not suggesting that everybody's cool, but at the same time, that to me that doesn't imply we tend to have these associations with implications of ultimate evil. So I'm try to stay away from those as much as possible. Okay, so let's talk about the stories here. So one of the first places we see it is in Aristophanes' play The Frogs. And apparently she's also mentioned in another play called the Ecclesiazusai, which I don't know how much of it is, how much of that play is actually available. Frogs, of course, we do have. So the comedy, of course, The Frogs is a comedy. And in this particular one, Empusa appears before Dionysus and his slave Xanthias on their way to the underworld. Although it is noted that this may be the slave's practical joke to frighten the master. Xanthias thus sees, or pretends to see, the Empusa transformed into a bull, a mule, a beautiful woman, and a dog. The slave also reassures that the being has indeed one brass or copper leg and another leg of cow dung. Okay. So you have, so again, whether, being this is a comedy, you don't know whether what you're seeing is real or not. But, because there is this kind of farcical component to it. And when I go through Sarah Iles Johnston, she talks a little bit more about what occurs in this play. But it's, but nonetheless, that it's certainly part of an initiatory rite that one goes through when as they're passing through. These kinds of figures. Oftentimes, also the Furies would be what was seen. You might see Tisiphone or one of the other Furies. An initiate might see somebody, probably somebody dressed up, as one of these terrifying beings. But coming to distract the person, or coming to try to frighten them or to attack them, and not really attack them so much, but more just distract and frighten them. And, so it's, so they definitely serve this role as to try to distract you from your purpose. And that may be, that's sort of another key to what they are. The fact, though, that they are also a category of angry dead means that they are, that there's another kind of element there about needing to appease them before one moves forward. If we understand the ancient ideas about dealing with death and about dealing with these spirits of the dead, especially the angry dead, is that you wanted to make sacrifices or propitiate them in some way to make them not angry with you, basically, or not to attack or assault you or harass you in any particular kind of a way. Now, just looking more at my notes here, it says the sorry, I'm just trying to move down in my things. I have this over here. Okay, the Empusa was a being, at least in some version, a scholiast said sent by Hecate, or in some versions was Hecate herself, according to a fragment of Aristophanes' lost play, Tagoniste, the Men of the Frying Pan, as preserved in the Venetus, which is another writing. And so, okay, so we definitely see this connection to Hecate. And later on, what I'm going to also talk about is this kind of, if we had one of those boards where you could, draw the connections in between, not only Hecate with the Empusa, who seem quite directly connected to her as a kind of infernal queen, but we also will see that a lot of the sea deities and sea monsters that we have talked about, everything from the Gorgons to the Grey Eye to Scylla and Charybdis, all, at least some of those also seem to have the Hecate connection. And also this idea, as we'll see, Empusa is supposedly one who lives in caves and ravines, or at least in the sort of biblical Onoskelis form, which also connects, to these ideas of these kind of monstrous figures that are associated with the sea, or with the caverns that are near the sea. Of course, as I think I've said frequently, the Greek underworld in particular was often, the sites that are said to be entrances are usually under a body of water of some kind and in a cave. So, so there's, this may just be all part of this kind of underworld imagery and about this whole idea of the cave or the abyss as representing these kinds of terrors. But anyway, I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. The other source that mentions her is the life of Apollonius, and it becomes to be believed, according to this, that this is by the late antiquity in Greece. So we're talking probably around the Hellenistic era, just before the Roman Empire era. It came to believe that a specter preyed on young men for seduction and for food. According to the life of Apollonius of Tyana, the Empusa is a phasma, or a phantom, that took on the appearance of an attractive woman and seduced a young philosophy student in order to eventually devour him. Okay, now this sounds a lot like our Len She, right? Which again was an invention of Yeats, but it's the idea of the female, the beautiful female who is the attractive inspiration, but also draining one of life at the same time. And it says, in a different passage from the same work, Apollonius was journeying from Persia to India. He encountered an Empusa, hurling insults at it, coaxing his fellow travelers to join him, whereby it ran and hid, uttering high-pitched screams. Now, it says that this Empusa also confessed to fattening, back to the student story, fattening it up she targeted to feed on him, and that she especially craved young men for the freshness and purity of their blood, prompting the interpretation of them as a blood-sucking vampire. Okay, so this idea of feeding. In this case, you have this idea of the attractive Empusa, who is there to act as this seductress anima figure that is kind of like the succubus, or kind of has like what we see also attributed to goddesses like Lilith, or beings like Lilith, who are considered to be these vampiric female figures. And the idea there is that by seducing someone into the pleasures of the flesh, that they are actually, weighing them down and draining their life force. You see evidence of this too when in Proverbs in the Bible. The idea of who they refer to as either the loose woman or the foreign woman is the use. It's funny, the translations are different between the Greek and the Hebrew, but the fact that those are both considered to be put together, I talk about that in my book, Death and the Maiden. It's fascinating how foreign-born and loose are somehow considered to be the same in some way. Although we may, in this case, they're thinking of foreign as coming from a strange place or from a strange land. So not from the familiar, right? And that such women with their seductive behavior drags men down to Sheol, down to death, which at that time was not considered to be a punishment; it was just death. But still, there's the idea of if you want to live, then you can't engage. Somehow that getting involved with the feminine in this way is going to take your life force away in some fashion, which is quite interesting. it goes back to this almost idea of the feminine, the dark feminine, as not as the one who provides and nurtures life, but as the one who's going to suck it out of you and take it away from you. So quite interesting there in the way that they're represented. So those are the main two ancient sources where we see the Empusa mentioned. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the connection to Onoskelis, who is not a demon mentioned. Like if you look at the Lesser Key of Solomon, the 72 demons, Onoskelis is not among those. I believe Jake Stratton Kent had referred to Onoskelis in some of his discussions of Hecate, which I haven't delved into for this particular episode. But I know that when we look at the Testament of Solomon, which, if you're not familiar with that story, it's the one in which King Solomon is, he's asked God for, holy wisdom, for wisdom, and God grants it to him, or the wisdom to rule correctly. And of course, God wants Solomon to build his temple, and so gives him a workforce of these 72 demons that we associate with the Goetia usually. But however, we do see names in there that we don't see in the Goetia proper, or they maybe have other equivalencies in the Goetia. And one of them is and by the way, when I say Goetia, I mean the Goetia, the Lesser Key of Solomon, not Goetia in general, which is sort of necromantic practice of ancient Greece. I just want to make sure that I'm not conflating those two things. But here from the Testament of Solomon, chapter 4, when, basically what happens is Solomon has his ring where he's commanding all of these spirits, and he calls them all before him and asks, they tell him about themselves, and also there's the idea of what angel binds them, and then he is able to assign them a particular task in building the temple. So the way she is described in there, or is Onoskelis, which again means donkey-footed. Her body was that of a woman with a fair complexion, but her legs were those of a mule. And when Solomon asked her what her purpose was, she stated, "I am a spirit which has been made into a body. I recline in a den on the earth. I make my home in caves. However, I have a many-sided character. Sometimes I strangle men. Sometimes I pervert them from their true natures. Most of the time, my habitats are cliffs, caves, and ravines. Frequently, I also associate with men who think of me as a woman, especially with those whose skin is honey-colored, for we are of the same constellation." That's interesting. "It is also true that they worship my star secretly and openly. They do not know that they deceive themselves and excite me to be an evildoer all the more. For they want to obtain gold by remembering me, but I grant little to those who seriously worship me." And her creation she describes as coming from an unexpected voice, which is called a voice of the echo of a black heaven, emitted in matter. Okay, that's interesting also. Coming out of this black heaven. There's this, you have to remember too that the conceptions of the underworld at that time were celestial. They were put in the sky. Even Hades was put in the sky at this point. And so this idea of her coming out of a black heaven into matter. So there's that descent from spirit to matter, and it's come from a black heaven. So there's, again, you kind of have this very, even though this is more Semitic or maybe even pseudo-Semitic in its origins, there's definitely a Platonic or Neoplatonic feel to this whole discussion. And it says, the last thing it says here this is about Onoskelis, is she travels by the full moon, and Solomon commanded her to spin hemp to construct the ropes used for the temple. She travels stealthily and kills indiscriminately. She is half hermit, barely daring to protrude her head out of her caves. So, so you definitely, and again, so this is the Testament of Solomon. So it certainly has a very much a biblical inflection. And we see all of the same associations. Even though this is Onoskelis, we still have this quote-unquote donkey-footed woman who is both, who is this sort of, who has this kind of seductive quality, but is out, again, that idea of the woman who feeds on flesh, or, feeds on, or basically deceives. The people who honor her in hoping to gain something from her gain very little. So so there's also that element of, they they want to obtain gold, but I actually grant very little to those who seriously, worship me or get involved with me. So again, there's this definite ethical inflection here about this soul figure who deals with the material world, right? Who deals in gold, but actually has very little to offer the spiritual person, right? So these, again, I'm just simply pointing out what all of these narratives are, and we can see the relationship between this kind of narrative and other ones that we have about these kinds of figures. But Empusa is interesting because as much as there's this seductive aspect, there's also the aspect that she serves in initiations and her connection to things like the Furies. So what I would like to do at this point is read a bit from Sarah Iles Johnston. She has a few things in talking about this initiation of Heracles as well. She has a little bit to say on the Empusa, so I'm gonna kind of go through this because this is really quite interesting. Because she's starting by talking about purifications associated with mystery cults. Okay, so she mentions first, she says, it's highly likely that ghosts or their agents, for example, the Erinyes or the Furies, were represented as threatening the initiate during some part of the process of initiation at Eleusis. This was probably intended to be understood as both a real threat at the time of the initiation, that is, the ghosts might try to prevent the completion of the initiation, as a passage from Proclus that we shall examine shortly suggests, and as a reminder of what awaited the uninitiated after death. So by the time we get to the mystery cult, see, this is why I have the opinion that these these are meant to be. It definitely takes a dim view of death and what you're going to find after death. Strictly speaking, death is a gloomy affair, but it's not necessarily a case that you are being punished after death. It's just a gloomy place. Those who have a reason to end up in Tartarus because they've deeply offended the gods or done something, really horrific, they are the ones who really only have anything to fear of this kind of horror. And and of course, when we talk about the underworld at this point, we are talking about more Platonic version of the underworld, which is not sort of the original ancient idea. We're talking about Proclus and Iamblichus. We're talking about Neoplatonism. Okay, so we've already got this very judgmental version of the underworld. But nonetheless, certainly this idea, as I've often said, the mystery cults are the first, manifestation of salvation from death, or salvation from the fear of death, if not from death itself. So, okay. So, to go on with Sarah Iles Johnson, when these ghosts, and she puts in quotes, appeared, it's hard to say. The constrained space of the telesterion, or the initiation hall, makes it unlikely that any catabasis or similar drama that depended heavily on visual details was enacted during the initiation ceremony itself, as not all of the initiates would have been able to see it clearly. And yet several of our sources speak of the initiates meeting something frightening or shocking in the darkness, which most likely means in the darkness of the night of their initiation. Perhaps we must imagine that whatever frightened the initiates lurked just inside the building, quote-unquote, greeting the initiates as they entered. Sounds like one of those haunted houses, doesn't it? Like, that they have it at Halloween time. In any case, after this stage of the process, according to our sources, the initiates would experience great pleasure, joy, and light, representing their safe passage through the danger. They would also perhaps, quote-unquote, meet the gods at this point. The sudden appearance of a great light could easily be staged in the telesterion in such a way that even the initiates farthest away would see it. So, okay, so this is the context of what she's talking about. And she talks about the agents. In his spoof of the mysteries, okay, Aristophanes, who of course writes satire, includes an Empusa, who appears just before Dionysus and Xanthias pass into the blissful portion of the underworld where the initiates are celebrating a feast. As we shall see shortly, the Empusa was one term for a restless and vindictive soul. Lucian's humorous Catabasis includes the appearance of the Erinyes Tisiphone out of the dark, which one of the characters says reminds him of what happened during the Eleusinian initiations. All of the Erinyes were understood to punish the living on behalf of the angry dead, but Tisiphone, whose name means avenger of murder, would be especially associated with avenging the violently dead. Okay. So the Empusa, especially since they are a form of restless dead, this reference to the Furies and of avenging murder is definitely worth noting here. Okay, so let me move on, because I don't want to. This isn't all entirely about that. I want to go back to just strictly what she says about the Empusa. Okay. She says, Empusa is particularly interesting in this respect. Her appearance in Aristophanes' Frogs should be taken more seriously than it usually is. Although Aristophanes may have given her ridiculously exaggerated appearance for comic effect, it seems that the Empusa was a real term for the sort of angry soul that was imagined to cause problems for both the initiate at some stage of the initiatory process and the uninitiated after death. Empusai are associated with Hecate in classical sources and described by late sources specifically as phasmata that Hecate can send forth, which virtually identifies them as one of the type of angry ghosts that Hecate controlled. Empusa is precisely the term applied to Aeschines' mother in connection with her practice of leaping out of the dark and frightening people in some mystery cult. It sounds as if she took part in a dramatic enactment of some kind during initiations, pretending to be a ghostly threat that initiates had to face. The name Empusa looks like a feminine appellative form of the same root of empodon, which means underfoot, and empodia, meaning impediment. Like the terms for many other demonic or ghostly creatures, it probably then began as a descriptive adjective, just as harpies snatched their victims, Harpazian. So Empusai hindered theirs, impeding secure passage of the soul either through the process of initiation or on the way to safe haven in Hades after death. Empusa, in short, looks very much like a common descriptive term for the sort of restless soul who tries to frighten, distract, and impede initiates during some stage of the initiation process at Eleusis and elsewhere. By purifying oneself of any trace of blood guilt at the lesser mysteries, one protected oneself against such threats during initiation at the greater mysteries, which in turn would protect one against them in the afterlife. A very close parallel offered in column 6 of the Dreveni Papyrus, which mentions daimones empodon, daemons who impede, and equates them with the souls of the dead, the psyche. These daimones empodon are described as being hateful to other souls, that is, causing problems for the initiates trying to protect their souls, who are instructed to propitiate the daemons by sacrifices, prayers, and incantations, or problems for the souls of the dead who are trying to pass into the underworld safely. Iamblichus, describing Theurgic initiations designed to save the soul, mentions that evil spirits, kaka pneumata, might serve an impediment, empodion, to those who have not been adequately purified. Okay. So now we're seeing them as representing almost this accusing faction of people who are entering the underworld, under this kind of judgment. And this, of course, when we're talking Iamblichus, we are talking about a much later, this is a later function, I think, of the Empusa. Because, again, as I've often said, initially we were not, the idea of judgment after death was a very minimal thing, only for people who were either extraordinarily like demigods, like they were extraordinary heroes, or people who were extraordinarily awful. And everybody else, it was pretty much the same thing. So, so this idea of divine punishment is certainly something that starts with Plato and comes later, and we kind of see that here. Theurgic initiations, which again, that's Neoplatonic, were modeled on those traditional mysteries, and thus Iamblichus's reference further confirms our interpretation of Aristophanes' Empusa and the daimones empodon. Okay, so that's so she talks about that, and then there's another section that we have in here about that. Let me just find it. It's let's see. Okay, so so column 6 of the Dreveni Papyrus and its daimones empodon are important in this respect as well. In this case, he was talking about the terrible, frightening ghosts that appear, and also about being freed from madness and things like that. So, and also, this is worth mentioning before I get into that. And according with the Theurgies' Platonizing tendencies, these demons were interpreted by the Theurgists as inflictors of corporeal passions that would lure the soul away from its proper pursuits, which of course would be philosophy, rather than angry souls, but the general pattern mimics that of long-established mysteries, as do many other elements of Theurgic initiation. Okay, I'm going to talk about initiation in a minute, but yeah. So in this case, yeah, he's seeing them as representing, interesting because they're supposed to be these at least in Aristophanes, they are horrific. The Empusa is a horrific looking creature. But again, we also have this, obviously the seductive element must be there, as another type of distraction. I mean, you could be, harassed by this angry spirit, or this spirit that might be very beautiful and trying to lure you towards worldly passions and away from, the aesthetic pursuits like philosophy that, in the rational world, and which I think is key here. But as an interpretation of something equally horrific. Okay. So column 6 of the Derveni Papyrus and its Daimonis Empodum are important in this respect as well. Exactly what cult is being discussed in this papyrus and for what reason are famously difficult questions to answer. But most scholars would agree it's probably a cult concerned with private mystery initiations of some sort, similar to those referred to in Plato in the Republic, which took the poems of Orpheus as their doctrinal basis. Right, because Plato is definitely Orphic in his inflection. The point of the cult seems to have been to prepare the individual's soul for a better afterlife by protecting it against the quote-unquote terrors of Hades. In this sense, it is quite similar to the Eleusinian and most other mystery cults. The magoi, that is, the special priests who conducted the rites, had to prevent the daimonis empodon from obstructing the initiate as he completed the process that would guarantee this. Okay. The magoi did so by offering prayers and sacrifices to the daimonis as if they were paying a penalty, and by chanting an incantation to keep the daimonis away. The phrase, as if they were paying a penalty, is interesting. It echoes phrases found in connection with Orphic and Bacchic cults that refer to the penalty each mortal had to pay to Persephone to atone for the death of her son Zagreus, or Dionysus, at the hand of the Titans. A penalty that expiates blood guilt, in other words. Here in column 6, however, the penalty is to be paid to the daimonis empodon, that is, the souls of the dead, not to Persephone, and it's hard not to infer that it is intended to atone for the deaths of these daimonis empodon themselves. Okay, so she says, thus we glimpse a situation much like the one I proposed in connection with Eleusis. Before initiation can be completed successfully, the souls of the angry dead who would otherwise impede the initiates must be appeased and averted. The actions taken by Dionysus and Xanthias against Empusa in the frogs seems to be a farcical version of such an aversion ritual. First, they beg the priest of Dionysus, who would have been sitting in the front row of the theater, to protect them, as a mystagogue or other official might help to protect an initiate. Then Xanthias adjures the monster to depart. After she is gone, he proclaims, "Be bold, all good things are now accomplished," a phrase that echoes a declaration supposedly made by the Eleusinian Hierophant, as well as other cultic declarations of salvation, and then swears thrice that she is really gone, the triplicity lending an oath an incantatory tone. Okay. Now she has an interesting follow-up paragraph to this. So she's trying to demonstrate, she says, in making a detour into the Eleusinian mysteries, she said, the Derveni Papyrus and the association between purification and averting dangerous souls. She says, I'm sought to demonstrate two things I believe are well supported by now. And the first takes us back to something she raises in an earlier chapter, the likelihood that performed the initiations were required to have expertise in the aversion or control of souls as well. Initiation and Goetia are two sides of the same coin, and help us to understand the Goes as essentially a psychologist of sorts, that is, an expert in souls. The second, more directly relevant to the topic of this chapter, which is the unavenged, she says the likelihood the rites more referred to in antiquity as purifications were concerned with appeasing and averting the angry dead, recognized by those who prefer to keep the miasma and biothanatoi, as well as their remedies, separated. So it's, okay. So a lot to think about there for a moment. So when we see here, okay, so now we're seeing, we can backtrack a little bit and look at what we're looking at here with the Empusa. So we have this idea of the Empusa as this kind of vampiric figure. Okay? Resides in the underworld, connected to Hecate, sometimes even sent by Hecate, or in some versions said to be an assistant of Hecate. We see this relationship to Onoskelis, who is listed to be as one of the demons who works on the Temple of Solomon. So on the one hand, you have this story of the Empusa that is, fattening up the philosophy student to eat, which actually could be a kind of, based on what we've just heard, this could also be, another way of that Neoplatonic idea that, this feminine seducer that's going to seduce you into something that eventually is just going to drain the life out of you and is going to, kill you and distract you away from that which should be your more noble or more virtuous pursuits. In which case, it seems to me the more overwhelming idea is that the Empusa, in spite of her donkey leg, her brass leg, or her dung leg, or whatever, it seems to actually appear as this attractive woman, except perhaps in Aristophanes, where she seems to be something horrific and terrifying. It has been noted that the Chtonic dead are not. It's very rare that any of the Chtonic deities actually attack people. They may be frightening, but they don't usually attack. But their role here in initiation, I find to be interesting. So let me sidetrack here for a little bit into the idea of initiation. Now, initiations are designed to be transformative. They're designed to move you, to shake you up and to break you out of one state and move you into another. Frequently, initiations that we see today, there's different types of ritual initiations. We could look at a lot of life passage rituals as initiations of sorts. And a lot of religions will have their, modern religions have their own versions of it, right? You'll have your baptism, you'll have your Eucharist, you have confirmation. If you are in, Catholic Church, certainly, and perhaps other Christian churches as well, there may be a baptism/confirmation, which is supposed to be a kind of initiatory rite of passage. You will have things like, the bar bat mitzvah for a Jewish child. You'll have, there's other equivalents, certainly within Hindu religion, there's a variety of different rite of passage rituals. And you can even take certain things like marriage, for example, to be a type of initiation as well. However, these initiations generally are... Initiations really are supposed to be about a kind of ordeal, something that you pass through that that has to shake you up enough to actually change you. Standing before the bishop at confirmation and having them maybe give you a little slap or something, that's not going to change you. Jung talks about this actually in his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, about how he was expecting some massive transformation at his confirmation in, I want to say, what was he in? Was he in the Lutheran church? I can't remember if he was Lutheran or Methodist, but I want to say Lutheran. But nonetheless, I just remember him, because this was the type of person that Jung always was, he was expecting this to be just transformed into this, and he said it was just such a disappointment, because literally it's just a bunch of rote words being read. And there's a lot of things that are initiatory that are like this. These things that are very, very low key and mild, they don't actually change you. I mean, they might make a bit of an emotional impact on you, but they don't actually change you. To change you, I mean, occult initiations generally, and of course, going back to what we're reading here about the rites of Eleusis, are generally there to scare the living crap out of you. Even okay, of the initiations I've undertaken, I mean, certainly I can say the ones I've undertaken have certainly been greater ordeals than what I would have gone through in any other ordinary setup. Like, for example, any of the Catholic rituals that I may have been gone through as a child. That said, it's also, a lot of these rituals too are, just because of the world we live in, insurance regulations, things like that, a lot of these rituals are also, watered down in some sense. They're not, they are trials, but they're not, and they do have an impact. I don't want to suggest that they don't, but probably the original forms of these rituals, the original intention of these rituals was probably a lot more dangerous. But there is a danger to be passed through. Now, if we go back to things that I've said about Persephone when I did the podcast on her a long time ago, one of the things that we see there, we have this idea of the young girl who is right at the edge of going into puberty. Now, if that is an initiatory moment, I don't know what is, because you are literally moving from childhood into this world of, like, you have your monthly menstruation, you have the blood You have this ability finally to create another human being, or to have another, to grow another human being. There's a whole body change that goes on, and there's a whole lot of psychological changes that go on as well. And in ancient cultures, or certainly in what we think of now as quote unquote primitive cultures, I don't necessarily think that, primitive implies something, of a regression, and I don't really think that they necessarily represent a regression. But these real kinds of initiations that you will see in like Aboriginal societies, or for example, not from personal experience, for what I understand might go on in voodoo societies and things like that. These initiations are, they are truly ordeals. You are put through something. You are not, you are broken. You are not the same person at the other end of this. And that's what a real initiation does. Now, there are initiations you can undergo with a mentor, or part of a group, or part of, a society or whatever. And there's also initiations that you can undergo, they're what I call natural initiations. We may have certain things that happen to us that qualify as like a natural initiation. And of course, you know what these things are, because these things really put you on the edge of life and death, as it were, or really put you into a space. And the question is, will you pass the ordeal? Passing the ordeal, people who have been through things, I'm just going to use this as an example, as a kind of a broad example. Somebody who goes through a terrifying incident and then decides, they're going to embrace some kind of really strong conservative religion. I passed through evil, and now I'm just going to cling to good. Has missed the point of the initiation. I'm just going to say it. They've just missed the point of the initiation. You're not passing through these kinds of things. It's meant, these things that you perceive as, and they may well be dangerous. I'm not sugarcoating and claiming that they're actually something really nice, because they're not. But they're, the whole point of this is to bring you into a different state, to break you out of this, really this overly logos-driven state of mind, which is why I think it's kind of funny and ironic when I see a lot of so much Platonic influence having to do with these kinds of initiations. Because, because a lot of where that Platonic thinking leads is just to the same place that a lot of, what we think of as modern monotheistic thinking leads. It's this over-rationalization of the world and this focus on spirit rather than soul. And initiation is meant to kind of take you back to the soul. It takes you back to that reality, that nature that you're connected to. We always talk about connecting with nature. We talk about grounding, right? You got to ground yourself. Most of the things that we do to ground ourselves don't really put us back in touch with nature. It's just a fact, because it's still something we're dealing with in kind of in a very cerebral kind of manner, where it's about thought, it's about rationality, it's about control of thoughts. This really has nothing to do with thoughts. This is something that's supposed to take you beyond thoughts. Okay. And and there's nothing more than like these primal emotions of terror, primal emotion, primal erotic emotions, primal, these things that are outside of the realm of rational control. It's sort of like that passing through the experience and internalizing the experience, rather than trying to analyze it and dissect it and intellectualize it, which is what separates us from it, and which what separates us from everything. Everything has a label, and that's not, you're not in a world of labels. You're in a very chaotic space, and you're in a space that does not necessarily support, all of the notions that you have associated with your own identity, or that you've associated with the world. It can take you outside. It's got to take you outside of that space. Frequently in my novels, I think part of the reason I don't more heavily advertise my novels, even though I think, I like the stuff I've written, and I like the new stuff that I've written. Generally, something happens in many of these novels, or many of these writings, that is taboo. Like something that's violating, and sometimes it really makes people uncomfortable. They'll write to me and they're like, why did you have to write about this? Or why did you have to write about that? And I'm like, part of it's because there's a taboo that needs to be violated. Violating that taboo breaks the wall. Now, I'm not saying that in order to experience initiation, you have to violate a taboo. But this idea, of the Empusa as being cannibalistic, that's certainly one taboo. Okay, the eating of human flesh is certainly taboo. Although that is kind of at least the symbolic or transubstantiated version of what goes on at Catholic Mass every Sunday. It's there's still this idea of the eating of flesh, committing of incest. What are some of the other things? Just other taboos, other things that you break. And I've talked about other types of taboos in my this is interesting. Okay, sorry, my computer just completely blanked out there. It's really funny. As soon as I mentioned my taboos, my notes blanked out. So yeah, there's this that the idea that is there is that it I remember, I think it was Diane Purkis in her work at the Bottom of the Garden, which is about fairy encounters, and she talks about these fairy cases from witchcraft trials, really. These people who have interacted with the fairies and the brother slept with the sister or something like that, and again, this is also none of this is behavior I'm advocating, just want to make that clear. But they were talking about how once they committed the act, they felt like they were magical. There's something that now takes you outside of the bounds of society. Okay. And it's interesting because one of the things initiation should do fundamentally is break boundaries. Okay. Now, figures like the Empusa, with respect to the Erinyes and the Furies, of course I did a podcast a while ago on the Furies as well, and one of the things that the role that they definitely seem to have, these terrifying women of the underworld, is to enforce boundaries. We can remember, Heraclitus saying, or allegedly saying, that if the sun decided to step an inch out of its bounds, the Erinyes would push it back. They established boundaries. They were the ones who, when matricide was committed, when somebody murdered their mother, that was considered to be, or certainly crimes just within the immediate family, that was something punishable by the Erinyes. As we see in the Oresteia, when Orestes kills his mother for murdering his father. Basically, he's really, between Scylla and Charybdis, between a rock and a hard place, because it's like he's got to avenge his father's death, but that means killing his mother. So really, neither thing that he does is acceptable. But there's this idea, too, with the Empusa, is this idea of, back to what she says about Persephone and the tribute, there's this idea that even though you may not personally be responsible for what happens, these acts of, either violence against women, because in this case you're talking about female entities who may be dead souls who have been unavenged or who are angry, or in the case of the Orphic myth of Dionysus or Zegrus, the idea is that the Titans take Dionysus and they cook him, rip him apart, and eat him. The baby Dionysus, and then he's put back together. But the tribute is owed to his mother Persephone even though he's resurrected, for his death. So there's this idea of having to pay penalty or pay tribute to the restless dead for their state, which is in some way considered to be almost unnatural. There's this violent element to it, but there's also this almost violent element to initiatory things as well. There are losses to be suffered. You don't come out on the other end the same person that you were, or with all of you in place as you were. So it's about smashing boundaries. So if you're going to encounter these beings like the Empusa or like the Erinyes, and they're there to distract you or to provide a boundary, the idea is that you're breaking past that boundary. Okay, you're passing through it in the appropriate way. You're not out to destroy these figures. You're out to get past them. So you are surpassing boundaries. You're not destroying them, because they may serve another purpose in another way. But the idea is that you as the initiate are blowing past that. Okay, and you are moving into another space. So but my point is, and again, I just want to make sure I reiterate when I'm talking about taboo violation, it's more the concept here that I'm talking about of pushing past social norms and mores and pushing past the boundaries that we have, the mental boundaries, as I often talk about, the fence mentality. I always talk about being fence jumpers. Anybody who's interested in more esoteric things and who wants to break out of, these kind of traditional logos-driven paradigms that we have, has to jump the fence, as it were, and spend some time in the forest. I'm speaking metaphorically, possibly literally, but there's this idea of breaking past this thing, and into the world of experience rather than just the world of analysis and rationality, which is very comfortable. Our rationalizations are very, very comfortable. But and our idea of willing something is very, very comfortable. But the reality is that our will only goes so far. And it's actually more about immersing yourself in that experience or becoming one with that experience rather than trying to, conquer something in some way. That's frequently a difficulty there. So in a sense, yes, there is a element of, say, conquering fear, but it's not a this is not about battling and destroying the dragon. This is not excuse me, not the harrowing of hell. This is not Christ coming down and liberating everybody from death. This is about facing up to what these things are, negotiating those boundaries and moving past them. So very interesting. These kinds of, and the way that these appear as these kind of female figures, perhaps in a more masculine construct. This is the idea that this aspect of the anima, in a Jungian sense, is challenging the male. That encounter with the feminine or with the dark feminine presents that kind of challenge, and how are you going to respond to that challenge? How are you going to respond to that test and to move past it? So I just want to see if I had anything else I wanted to say about this. I think, the only other thing I had mentioned here in my notes about this was, again, the connection to sea deities and monsters. As we saw at the Grey Eye last week, Perseus in his quest. So what does he do? His quest is to slay Medusa, but his quest is also he needs to trick and get past the Grey Eye as well. All of which present these feminine figures, which present these obstacles to moving through the underworld or moving into these spaces where we are confronted with these boundaries. And a lot of these boundaries are representations of dread and terror and of things that we fear. And the question is, how do you appropriately negotiate that and move through it? It's not about dragon slaying. We're not going down to destroy these entities. You're going through to negotiate them and move past them in a way that is visceral and not intellectual. Okay. Now the philosophers may assume that there's an intellectual basis for it, but it's really more about breaking out of that mental world that cuts us off from the rest of the world. So that's all I'm going to say on Empusa. I could probably after I'm done, I'll probably think of a few more things I could probably say. That might end up in a Patreon podcast. But I want to thank you again for listening. If you're interested in my work, please check out Chthonia.net. That has all the basics. The basic podcast is there. The podcast is also on Spreaker. Or obviously you're listening to this somewhere, possibly on YouTube, because I have the Chthonia channel on YouTube. And I also have Patreon, patreon.com/Chthonia, if you would like to support this work. I'm working on a lot of extra material to provide, usually in the form of extra podcasts, but sometimes there are other offerings, and certainly when I have certain writings in a form, ready to be pre-published, that's also something I will share with patrons first, hoping to be at that stage fairly soon, actually, for some of the work that I'm working on. And also that's where I give updates. I also give a lot of updates on social media. Chthonia Podcast, 2 words on Facebook, 1 word on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you again for listening. Thank you so much to my patrons. You are an amazing and humbling bunch. It's in the way that you continue to support me. I'm always very grateful for those who choose to support me. I have great appreciation for for everybody who's been invested in this work with me. So thanks again, and until the next episode.